The city was quiet, wrapped in the stillness of the late night. The occasional hum of a passing car or the distant bark of a dog were the only sounds breaking the silence. David sat at his desk in the dimly lit police station, finishing up the last bit of paperwork for his shift. His eyes were heavy, and he longed for the comfort of his small apartment and the warm bed waiting for him. It had been a long day, and he was ready to call it a night. Just as he was about to pack up, the phone on his desk rang. The sharp sound cut through the quiet room, making him pause. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 11:47 p.m. Calls this late were rarely good news. With a sigh, he picked up the receiver. "Officer David speaking," he said, his voice steady despite the fatigue. "Hello? Is this the police?" a shaky voice asked on the other end. It was a woman, her tone filled with urgency and fear. "Yes, ma'am. What's the situation?" David straightened in his chair, his senses immediately on high alert. I live next door to this house, and I've been hearing a child crying. It's been going on for hours," the woman said, her voice trembling. "And earlier I heard yelling. A man's voice. It sounded angry. I think something's wrong." David's grip on the phone tightened. "Can you give me the address, ma'am?" The woman quickly rattled off the location. Her words rushed. It was a small house in a quiet neighborhood not far from the station. David jotted it down on a notepad. "Have you seen anything unusual? Any signs of violence?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "No, I haven't seen anything. I didn't want to get too close. But the crying, it's so heartbreaking. It sounds like a little girl. Please, you have to check it out," the woman pleaded. David nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I'll head over there right away. Thank you for calling. Stay inside and don't approach the house. We'll handle it." "Thank you, officer," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper before the line went dead. David hung up the phone and grabbed his jacket, his mind already racing. Calls like this were the ones that hit him the hardest. As a father himself, he couldn't stand the thought of a child being hurt or in danger. He had a daughter, Emma, though he hadn't seen her in years. The thought of her always brought a pang of guilt and sadness, but he pushed it aside. Right now, there was another child who might need his help. He grabbed his radio and informed dispatch of the situation. "This is Officer David. I'm responding to a possible child welfare issue at 14 Maple Street, requesting backup, but I'll proceed to the location immediately." "Copy that, Officer David. Backup is on the way," the dispatcher replied. David stepped out into the cool night air, the chill biting at his skin. He climbed into his patrol car, the engine roaring to life as he sped toward the address. The streets were mostly empty, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. As he drove, his mind replayed the woman's words. A child crying, yelling. It didn't sit right with him. When he arrived at the house, he parked a short distance away and turned off the engine. The house was small and unassuming, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The windows were dark, but something about the place felt off. He sat in the car for a moment, observing. The neighborhood was silent, but as he rolled down his window, he thought he could hear it, a faint, muffled sound, crying. David's jaw tightened. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He approached the house cautiously, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. He knocked on the door firmly. "Police, is anyone home?" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. There was no response. He knocked again, harder this time. "This is the police, open the door!" Still nothing. The crying had stopped, and the sudden silence made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He tried the doorknob, but it was locked. He stepped back, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. David reached for his radio. "This is Officer David. I'm at the location. No response at the door, but I can hear faint noises inside, requesting immediate backup." "Copy that, Officer David. Backup is en route," the dispatcher replied. David didn't want to wait. If a child was in danger, every second counted. He moved to the side of the house, peering through a window. The glass was dirty, but he could make out a dimly lit interior. The place was a mess, furniture overturned, trash scattered across the floor. His gut twisted. Something bad had happened here. He returned to the front door and made a decision. "If anyone's inside, I'm coming in," he shouted, giving one last warning. When there was still no response, he kicked the door in with a single, forceful motion. The door frame splintered, and the door swung open with a loud crash. David stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy, filled with the stench of mildew and something sour. The living room was in complete disarray, with broken furniture and empty beer bottles littering the floor. David's eyes scanned the room, his flashlight sweeping over every corner. "Police! Is anyone here?" he called out, his voice firm. Then he heard it, a faint, muffled whimper coming from somewhere deeper in the house. His heart pounded as he followed the sound, moving down a narrow hallway. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper and the floor creaked under his weight. At the end of the hall, a door was slightly ajar. The sound was coming from inside. David pushed the door open slowly, his flashlight illuminating the small room. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. In the corner of the room, huddled on the floor, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her thin frame was wrapped in a dirty blanket, and her knees were pulled up to her chest. Her face was pale, her cheeks streaked with tears. But what struck David the most were the bruises, dark, angry marks on her arms and legs. "Sweetheart," David said softly, lowering his flashlight so it wouldn't blind her. "It's okay. I'm here to help." The girl flinched at the sound of his voice, her wide eyes filled with fear. She pressed herself further into the corner as if trying to disappear. David crouched down, keeping his voice gentle. "You're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you. Can you tell me your name?" The girl didn't respond, her small body trembling. David's heart ached at the sight of her. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he knew he had to be careful. "It's okay," he said again. "I'm a police officer. I'm here to help you." Finally, the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "Emma." David froze. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He stared at her, his mind racing. It couldn't be. But as he looked closer, he saw it. The familiar curve of her face, the same dark eyes he had seen every day in his memories. "Emma," he said, his voice breaking. "It's me. It's Dad." The girl's eyes widened, and for a moment she just stared at him. Then, as if something inside her broke, she burst into tears and threw herself into his arms. "Daddy!" she sobbed, clinging to him tightly. David held her close, his own tears streaming down his face. "I've got you, baby. I've got you. You're safe now." David parked his patrol car at the end of the narrow alley, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The house stood at the very end, shrouded in shadows, its peeling paint and broken shutters giving it an eerie, abandoned look. A single dim light flickered in one of the windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. The air was cold, biting at his skin as he stepped out of the car, and the silence was almost suffocating. He stood still for a moment, listening. The faint sound of crying he had heard earlier on the phone was now barely audible, almost as if it were being swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the night. His instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong, very wrong. David approached the house cautiously, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. His hand rested on the holster of his gun, ready for anything. He stopped at the front door, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The porch was cluttered with old broken furniture, and the faint smell of mildew and decay lingered in the air. He knocked firmly on the door. "Police! Is anyone home?" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. There was no response. He knocked again, harder this time, his fist pounding against the wood. "This is the police! Open the door!" The crying stopped. The sudden silence sent a chill down his spine. He pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear anything. Movement, voices, anything at all. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive, suffocating quiet. David stepped back, his jaw tightening. He reached for his radio. "This is Officer David. I'm at the location. No response at the door. The crying has stopped. Requesting immediate backup." "Copy that, Officer David. Backup is en route," the dispatcher replied. David lowered the radio, his eyes fixed on the door. He couldn't wait. If a child was in danger, every second mattered. He took a deep breath and called out again, his voice firm and commanding. "This is the police. If anyone is inside, open the door now." Still nothing. His patience was wearing thin, and his gut told him that whoever was inside wasn't going to cooperate. He stepped back, his voice rising. "I'm coming in. If anyone is in there, make yourself known now." The house remained silent. David clenched his jaw, his decision made. He couldn't risk waiting any longer. He took a step back, bracing himself, and then slammed his shoulder into the door. The old wood splintered under the force, the door swinging open with a loud crash. David stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air inside was heavy, damp, and filled with the stench of mold and something sour. The living room was a mess, furniture overturned, trash scattered across the floor, and empty beer bottles rolling underfoot. The dim light he had seen from outside came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering weakly. "Police! Is anyone here?" David called out, his voice echoing through the house. There was no response. He moved further inside, his flashlight sweeping over the room. The walls were stained and peeling, and the floor creaked under his weight. He stepped carefully, his senses on high alert. His hand hovered near his gun, ready to draw it at a moment's notice. As he moved through the house, he noticed signs of recent activity: dirty dishes piled in the sink, a half-eaten meal on the table, and a jacket draped over the back of a chair. Someone had been here recently, but where were they now? David's flashlight landed on a hallway leading deeper into the house. The faint smell of something metallic, blood maybe, hung in the air, making his stomach churn. He moved cautiously down the hallway, his boots barely making a sound on the worn wooden floor. At the end of the hall, he saw a door slightly ajar. A faint, muffled sound came from inside, a whimper, barely audible. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door, his flashlight trained on the crack. He pushed the door open slowly, his other hand resting on his gun. The room was small and dimly lit, with only a single lamp on a nightstand casting a weak glow. The walls were bare, the floor covered in stains and dirt. In the corner of the room, huddled on the floor, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her thin frame was wrapped in a dirty blanket, and her knees were pulled up to her chest. Her face was pale, her cheeks streaked with tears. David's breath caught in his throat. "Sweetheart," he said softly, lowering his flashlight so it wouldn't blind her. "It's okay. I'm here to help." The girl flinched at the sound of his voice, her wide eyes filled with fear. She pressed herself further into the corner as if trying to disappear. David crouched down, keeping his voice gentle. "You're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you. Can you tell me your name?" The girl didn't respond, her small body trembling. David's heart ached at the sight of her. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he knew he had to be careful. "It's okay," he said again. "I'm a police officer. I'm here to help you." Finally, the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "Emma." David froze. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He stared at her, his mind racing. It couldn't be. But as he looked closer, he saw it, the familiar curve of her face, the same dark eyes he had seen every day in his memories. "Emma," he said, his voice breaking. "It's me. It's Dad." The girl's eyes widened, and for a moment she just stared at him. Then, as if something inside her broke, she burst into tears and threw herself into his arms. "Daddy!" she sobbed, clinging to him tightly. David held her close, his own tears streaming down his face. "I've got you, baby. I've got you. You're safe now." As he held her, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned, his hand instinctively going to his gun, but it was his backup, a fellow officer entering the house. "David, are you okay?" the officer asked, his eyes scanning the room. David nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion in his chest. "I found her. She's safe now." The officer's gaze softened as he looked at the little girl in David's arms. "We'll get her out of here. Let's secure the house." David nodded, his focus still on Emma. "It's over now," he whispered to her. "You're safe, I promise." David stepped cautiously into the house, his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air was thick and stale, carrying the faint stench of mildew and something metallic. Blood, perhaps. The living room was a mess, with broken furniture, empty beer bottles, and trash scattered across the floor. The walls were stained, the wallpaper peeling in long, jagged strips. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his boots echoed through the silence, amplifying the tension in the air. He moved deeper into the house, his senses on high alert. His flashlight swept over the chaos, but there was no sign of anyone. Then he heard it, a faint, muffled sound coming from somewhere down the hall. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A child's whimper. David's heart clenched. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and moved quickly but carefully toward the sound. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, the walls closing in on him as he approached a door at the very end. It was slightly ajar, and the sound was coming from inside. He paused for a moment, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. "Police!" he called out, his voice firm but steady. "If anyone's in there, make yourself known." There was no response, only the faint sound of crying. David pushed the door open slowly, his flashlight illuminating the small room. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. In the corner of the room, huddled on the floor, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her thin frame was wrapped in a dirty, tattered blanket, and her knees were pulled up to her chest. Her face was pale, her cheeks streaked with tears, and her dark hair hung limply around her shoulders. But it wasn't just her frail appearance that struck David. It was the bruises. Dark, angry marks covered her arms and legs, a stark contrast against her pale skin. David's stomach churned, a wave of anger and sorrow washing over him. But then, as he looked closer, his heart stopped. The curve of her face, the shape of her eyes, it was impossible to mistake. He felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. "Emma," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The girl flinched at the sound of his voice, her wide, terrified eyes darting toward him. She pressed herself further into the corner as if trying to disappear. David dropped to his knees, his flashlight clattering to the floor as he reached out toward her. "Emma," he said again, his voice breaking. "It's me. It's Dad." The girl froze, her small body trembling. For a moment she just stared at him, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. Then, as if something inside her broke, she burst into tears. "Daddy?" she sobbed, her voice trembling and raw. David nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, baby. It's me. I'm here. You're safe now." Emma hesitated for only a second before she threw herself into his arms, clutching him tightly. "Daddy!" she cried, her small body shaking against his. David held her close, his arms wrapped protectively around her. "I've got you, baby. I've got you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now. I promise." Emma buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking through his shirt. "I was so scared," she choked out. "I thought you'd never find me." David's heart broke at her words. He stroked her hair gently, his own tears falling freely. "I'm so sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry I wasn't there, but I'm here now, and I'm never letting you go again." For a long moment they stayed like that, father and daughter clinging to each other, as if the world around them didn't exist. David could feel the weight of her small body in his arms, the fragility of her frame, and it only fueled his determination. Whoever had done this to her would pay. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her face. "Are you hurt, sweetheart? Can you tell me what happened?" Emma sniffled, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "It hurts," she said softly, pointing to her arm, where a large bruise was visible. "And my tummy, it hurts too." David's jaw tightened, his anger simmering just beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay calm for her sake. "Okay, baby, we're going to get you out of here, and we'll get you to a doctor. They'll make sure you're okay." Emma nodded, her trust in him absolute. "Don't leave me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't," David said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere, I promise." Just then, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, his hand instinctively going to his gun, but it was his backup, a fellow officer entering the house. "David, are you okay?" the officer asked, his eyes scanning the room. David nodded, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "I found her. It's Emma. She's safe now." The officer's gaze softened as he looked at the little girl in David's arms. "We'll get her out of here. Let's secure the house first." David nodded, his focus still on Emma. "It's over now," he whispered to her. "You're safe. I promise." Emma clung to him tightly, her small hands gripping his shirt as if afraid he might disappear. David stood, lifting her easily in his arms. She was so light, too light, and it only deepened his resolve. He carried her out of the room, his fellow officer following close behind. As they stepped into the hallway, Emma buried her face in his shoulder, her tears finally beginning to subside. David held her close, his heart aching for everything she had been through, but he also felt a fierce sense of relief. He had found her. After 3 long years, he had finally found his daughter. When they reached the front door, David stepped outside into the cool night air. The flashing lights of police cars illuminated the street, and paramedics were already waiting. He approached them, his voice calm but urgent. "She needs medical attention," he said, his arm still wrapped protectively around Emma. "She's hurt." One of the paramedics stepped forward, her expression gentle. "We'll take care of her, officer. You can come with her if you'd like." David nodded, his grip on Emma tightening slightly. "I'm not leaving her," he said firmly. Emma looked up at him, her eyes still filled with tears but also a glimmer of hope. "You won't leave me, right, Daddy?" "Never," David said, his voice steady and full of conviction. "I'll never leave you again." As the paramedics led them to the ambulance, David felt a mix of emotions: relief, anger, sorrow, and determination. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He would do whatever it took to protect Emma and make sure she never had to feel afraid again. David sat on the back of the ambulance, holding Emma tightly in his arms as the paramedics checked her over. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cars illuminated the dark street, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Emma clung to him, her small hands gripping his shirt as if afraid he might disappear. He stroked her hair gently, whispering soft reassurances, though his own heart was pounding with a mix of anger, confusion, and sorrow. "It's okay, baby," he murmured, his voice trembling slightly. "You're safe now. I promise. No one will ever hurt you again." Emma didn't say much. She just buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking through his shirt. David could feel her trembling, and it broke his heart. He had so many questions, but he knew now wasn't the time to ask them. Right now, she needed to feel safe. One of the paramedics approached cautiously, her voice soft. "Officer, we need to take her to the hospital for a full checkup. She's stable, but we need to make sure there are no internal injuries." David nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'm coming with her." The paramedic gave him a small, understanding smile. "Of course. We'll leave as soon as you're ready." David looked down at Emma, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Emma, sweetheart, we're going to the hospital now. They're going to make sure you're okay. I'll be with you the whole time, I promise." Emma looked up at him, her big, tear-filled eyes searching his face. "You won't leave me, right?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Never," David said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "I'll never leave you again." As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle began to move, David held Emma close, his mind racing. How had it come to this? How had his little girl ended up in that house, bruised and terrified? He thought back to the years of silence after his ex-wife Sarah had left with Emma. He had tried to find them, but Sarah had cut off all contact, disappearing without a trace. Now, sitting here with Emma in his arms, he realized the truth was far worse than he could have imagined. At the hospital, Emma was taken into a private room where doctors began their examination. David stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and reassuring her whenever she looked scared. The bruises on her small body were stark against her pale skin, and every time David saw them, a fresh wave of anger surged through him. Whoever had done this to her would pay. After what felt like hours, the doctor finally stepped out of the room to speak with David. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes, but his expression was serious. "Officer, your daughter is stable," the doctor began. "She has multiple bruises and some minor cuts, but thankfully there are no internal injuries. She's malnourished, though, and it's clear she's been under significant stress for a prolonged period of time." David's fists clenched at his sides. "How long?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "How long has she been like this?" The doctor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's hard to say exactly, but based on her condition, I'd estimate several months, if not longer." David closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "Thank you, doctor," he said quietly. "Can I stay with her?" "Of course," the doctor replied. "She's been asking for you. Just let us know if you need anything." David nodded and stepped back into the room. Emma was sitting up in the hospital bed, her small frame dwarfed by the blankets wrapped around her. She looked so fragile, but when she saw him, a small smile broke through her fear. "Daddy," she said softly. David sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "I'm here, baby. I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything unspoken hanging in the air. Finally, David spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Emma, sweetheart, I need to ask you something. Can you tell me what happened? How did you end up in that house?" Emma's smile faded and she looked down at her hands. "It was Mommy," she said quietly. She took me there." David's heart sank. "Mommy?" he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "Why would she take you there?" Emma hesitated, her small fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "She was scared," she said finally. "Of him." David's stomach turned. "Him? Who are you talking about, Emma?" Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. "Tom, Mommy's boyfriend." David felt a surge of anger so intense it made his hands shake. He forced himself to stay calm for Emma's sake. "Did he hurt you, Emma?" he asked, his voice trembling. Emma nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "He got mad a lot. He would yell and hit me. Mommy tried to stop him, but he would yell at her too. She said we couldn't leave because he would find us." David's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together. He wanted to scream, to punch something, but he knew that wouldn't help Emma. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Emma, listen to me. None of this is your fault. Do you hear me? None of it. And I promise you, he will never hurt you again." Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide. "You promise?" "I swear," David said, his voice firm. I'm going to make sure he pays for what he did to you, and I'm going to keep you safe, always." Emma nodded, her small hand gripping his tightly. "I believe you, Daddy." The next day, David began his investigation. He pulled every resource he had, determined to find out everything about Tom and what had happened to Sarah and Emma over the past 3 years. What he uncovered made his blood boil. After leaving David, Sarah had fallen into a toxic relationship with Tom, a man with a history of violence and abuse. He had isolated her, cutting her off from friends and family, and used fear to control her. When Emma had become the target of his anger, Sarah had tried to protect her, but she had been too scared to leave. The cycle of abuse had continued, leaving both Sarah and Emma trapped. David sat at his desk, staring at the file in front of him. His hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He couldn't believe the woman he had once loved had allowed this to happen. But at the same time, he knew fear could make people do desperate things. He didn't hate Sarah. He pitied her. But Tom? Tom was a different story. David picked up his phone and called his partner. "I need a warrant," he said, his voice cold and determined. "We're bringing him in." His partner hesitated. "You sure you're ready for this, David? It's personal." David's grip on the phone tightened. "Damn right it's personal. He hurt my daughter, and I'm going to make sure he never hurts anyone else again." David stood outside the small, run-down house, his jaw clenched and his fists tight at his sides. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the yard, but the light did nothing to soften the darkness he felt inside. Today was the day. He wasn't going to let Tom Harris, the man who had hurt his daughter, walk free. Justice was coming, and David would make sure of it. His partner, Officer Martinez, stood beside him, checking his weapon. "You ready for this?" Martinez asked, glancing at David. David nodded, his voice cold and steady. "I've been ready since the moment I found Emma." Martinez gave him a small nod of understanding. "Let's do this." The two officers approached the front door, their movements swift and precise. David pounded on the door with his fist, his voice booming. "Police! Open the door!" There was no response. David's patience was already thin, and he wasn't about to waste time. He motioned to Martinez, and together they forced the door open, the wood splintering under the pressure. Inside, the house was just as filthy and chaotic as it had been the night David found Emma. The stench of alcohol and decay hung in the air. "Tom Harris!" David shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "This is the police! Come out with your hands up!" There was a crash from one of the back rooms, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. David's adrenaline surged as he and Martinez moved quickly toward the noise. They found Tom trying to climb out of a back window, his movements clumsy and panicked. "Freeze!" David barked, his gun drawn and aimed at the man. "Don't move!" Tom froze, his hands raised in the air. He turned slowly, his face pale and sweaty. Hey, man, let's talk about this," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I didn't do anything wrong." David's jaw tightened, his anger barely contained. "You didn't do anything wrong?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "You abused an innocent little girl. You think I'm going to let you walk away from that?" Tom's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but there was none. Martinez stepped forward, cuffing him quickly and efficiently. "You're under arrest for child abuse and assault," Martinez said, his tone professional but firm. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Martinez led Tom out of the house, David followed, his eyes never leaving the man who had caused so much pain. He wanted to say more, to unleash the fury that burned inside him, but he knew he couldn't. His job was to bring Tom to justice, not to let his emotions take over. Later that day, David sat in the hospital room with Emma. She was propped up in bed, a stuffed animal clutched tightly in her arms. The doctors had assured him that she was healing physically, but the emotional scars would take much longer to mend. David knew that, and it broke his heart, but he also knew he would do whatever it took to help her heal. "Daddy?" Emma's small voice broke the silence. David looked up from the chair beside her bed, his expression softening. "Yes, sweetheart." "Is he gone?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The bad man?" David reached out and took her hand in his grip gentle but firm. "Yes, baby. He's gone. He can't hurt you anymore, I promise." Emma nodded, her eyes still filled with uncertainty. "What about Mommy? Is she okay?" David hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Mommy is safe now. She's going to get help, just like you are, and I'm going to make sure both of you are okay." Emma looked down at the stuffed animal in her lap, her fingers tracing the fabric. "I was so scared, Daddy," she whispered. "I thought you'd never find me." David's chest tightened, and he leaned forward, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Emma. I should have found you sooner. I should have been there to protect you, but I promise you, from now on, I'll always be here. You'll never have to be scared again." Emma looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears. "You really promise?" David nodded, his own eyes misty. "I promise with all my heart." Emma leaned forward, wrapping her small arms around his neck. David held her tightly, his heart aching with both love and regret. He couldn't change the past, but he could make sure her future was filled with safety and love. In the days that followed, David dedicated every moment to being with Emma. He took time off work, knowing that nothing was more important than helping his daughter heal. They spent hours together, talking, playing, and simply being close. David could see the fear in her eyes slowly begin to fade, replaced by a cautious sense of trust. One afternoon, as they sat together in the hospital's playroom, Emma looked up at him with a small smile. "Daddy, can we go home soon?" David smiled back, his heart swelling with hope. "Yes, sweetheart. As soon as the doctors say you're ready, we'll go home, and I'll make sure it's the best home ever. Just you and me." Emma's smile grew, and for the first time in what felt like forever, David saw a glimmer of the happy, carefree little girl she had once been. It gave him strength, reminding him that no matter how long the road to recovery might be, they would walk it together. Meanwhile, Sarah, David's ex-wife, was placed into a witness protection program. She had agreed to testify against Tom, providing crucial evidence that would ensure he faced the full weight of the law. David had mixed feelings about her, anger for the choices she had made, but also pity for the fear and manipulation she had endured. He didn't know if he could ever forgive her, but for Emma's sake, he hoped she would find a way to rebuild her life. The day of Tom's trial came quickly. David sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched tightly as he listened to the evidence presented. Sarah's testimony was damning, and the evidence David and his team had gathered left no room for doubt. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on all counts, David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice had been served. As they left the courthouse, Martinez clapped a hand on David's shoulder. "You did it, man. You got him." David nodded, his expression resolute. "It wasn't just me. It was for Emma. She deserves to feel safe." That evening, David sat with Emma in her hospital room, watching as she colored in a sketchbook the nurses had given her. She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "Daddy, can we get a dog when we go home?" she asked, her voice filled with a childlike hope that made David smile. "A dog, huh?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "I think we can make that happen, but you'll have to help take care of it." Emma giggled, a sound that warmed David's heart. "I will, I promise." David reached out and ruffled her hair. "Then it's a deal." As Emma returned to her drawing, David watched her, his heart full. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he knew they would face it together. With love, patience, and time, they would heal. And for the first time in years, David felt a sense of peace. He had his daughter back, and nothing would ever take her away from him again. The morning sun streamed through the windows of David's modest home, casting a warm glow over the living room. The sound of laughter echoed through the house, a sound that had been absent for far too long, but now filled every corner with life. David stood in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee, a small smile tugging at his lips as he listened to Emma giggle in the next room. "Max, stop it! That tickles!" Emma's voice rang out, followed by the excited barking of their golden retriever puppy. David leaned against the counter, watching from the doorway as Emma rolled on the floor with Max, her laughter contagious. Her cheeks were flushed, her dark hair falling in messy waves around her face. She looked happy, truly happy, and it was a sight that David would never take for granted. "All right, you two," David called out, his voice warm. "If you keep playing like that, Max is going to think he's the boss around here." Emma sat up, grinning as she hugged the squirming puppy. "But he's so cute, Daddy. Look at his face. How could he not be the boss?" David chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, as long as he doesn't start asking for coffee in the mornings, I think we'll be okay." Emma giggled again, her eyes sparkling with joy. It was moments like this that reminded David how far they had come. A year ago, Emma had been a scared, fragile little girl, haunted by the trauma she had endured. Now she was thriving, her laughter a testament to her resilience and the love they had rebuilt together. Later that day, David and Emma sat on the porch, enjoying the crisp autumn air. The leaves had turned shades of red and gold, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of the season. Max lay at their feet chewing on a stick, his tail wagging lazily. "Daddy," Emma said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Do you think I'll ever forget, the bad stuff?" David looked at her, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her voice. He set down his coffee mug and reached for her hand, holding it gently. "Sweetheart, I don't think we ever completely forget the hard things we've been through, but I do think that over time they hurt less, and the good memories we make, like this one, start to take their place." Emma nodded thoughtfully, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I like the good memories," she said softly. "Like when we got Max, or when we went to the park and you pushed me on the swings." David smiled, squeezing her hand. "Me too, Emma, and we're going to keep making more of those, as many as we can." Emma turned to him, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I'm not scared anymore, Daddy, not like I used to be." David felt a lump rise in his throat, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "I'm so proud of you, Emma. You're the bravest person I know." Emma smiled, leaning her head against his arm. "That's because I have you," she said simply. David wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "And you always will, baby. Always." Over the past year, David had worked tirelessly to create a safe and loving environment for Emma. He had taken her to therapy sessions, where she had slowly opened up about her experiences. It hadn't been easy. There were nights when she woke up crying, and days when the weight of her memories seemed too much to bear. But through it all, David had been there, offering her the unwavering support and love she needed. He had also worked on himself, confronting the guilt and anger that had consumed him after discovering what Emma had endured. Therapy had helped him too, giving him the tools to be the father Emma needed. He had learned to forgive himself for the years they had been apart, focusing instead on the present and the future they were building together. Their story had gained attention in the community, and David had been approached by a local journalist who wanted to write about their journey. At first, David had been hesitant. He didn't want to expose Emma to any more attention than she was comfortable with. But after discussing it with her, they had agreed to share their story, hoping it might inspire others who were going through similar struggles. The article had been published a few months ago, and the response had been overwhelming. People from all walks of life had reached out, sharing their own stories of resilience and thanking David and Emma for their courage. It had been a humbling experience, and David had realized that their journey wasn't just about healing themselves, it was about showing others that healing was possible. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David and Emma sat together on the couch, flipping through a scrapbook they had started. Each page was filled with photos and mementos from the past year, pictures of their trip to the zoo, Emma's first day at her new school, and of course the day they brought Max home. "Look at this one," Emma said, pointing to a photo of her and Max covered in mud after a particularly messy day at the park. "You were so mad, but it was so funny," David laughed, shaking his head. "I wasn't mad. I was just wondering how I was going to get all that mud out of the car." Emma giggled, her laughter filling the room. "It was worth it, though. Max had so much fun." David smiled, his heart full. "Yeah, it was worth it." As they turned the pages, Emma paused at a photo of the two of them standing in front of their house, Max sitting proudly at their feet. She traced the edges of the picture with her finger, her expression thoughtful. "Daddy," she said quietly, "do you think Mommy will ever come back?" David's smile faded slightly, but he kept his tone gentle. "I don't know, sweetheart. Mommy's working on getting better, just like you are. But no matter what happens, you'll always have me, and I'll always make sure you're safe." Emma nodded, her eyes shining with trust. "I know, Daddy. I'm not scared anymore." David leaned over and kissed the top of her head. "That's my brave girl." As the night wore on, Emma fell asleep on the couch, her head resting on David's shoulder. Max curled up at their feet, his soft snores filling the quiet room. David sat there for a long time, watching his daughter sleep, his heart filled with gratitude. He thought about everything they had been through, the fear, the pain, the uncertainty, and how far they had come. There were still challenges ahead, but David knew they would face them together. Emma was his light, his reason for everything, and he would never let anything take her away from him again. As he sat there holding his daughter close, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The darkness that had once consumed their lives was fading, replaced by the warmth of love and hope. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that everything was going to be okay, because it was. They had found their way out of the darkness, and now, together, they were walking toward the light.